Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the weekly internet show sponsored by the Future of Freedom Foundation that brings you the libertarian perspectives on the burning issues of the day. Today, I'm really pleased to have a special guest or a special co-host for Libertarian Angle, Ted Grimsrud, who is the author of a fantastic book called The Good War That Wasn't. That's about World War II. And I recently discovered this book. We're having it reviewed for our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. And I couldn't put it down. Once I started reading it, I absolutely couldn't put it down. It's absolutely one of the best books you will ever read on foreign policy, World War II, the aftermath of World War II, all the way up to today. And it really explains in an easy to read, succinct manner the root of the problems that are facing America today, at least insofar as foreign policy, the war on terrorism, the national security state, and so forth. So I can't sell the book to you more highly. I mean, recommend it to you. It's just absolutely fantastic. So Ted, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jacob, and I really appreciate your kind words.
Yeah, well, I mean every one of them. And we've been saying the things that you say in your book for 25 years. But boy, the way you put it together, I mean, you just put it all together in a very logical format, very easy to read. I mean, it's a very accessible book. Tell us a little bit about what you do, about your background, and then we'll get into the book.
I'm a professor of theology and peace studies at Eastern Mennonite University. My parents are both World War II veterans, so I grew up with kind of the good war as part of just kind of my consciousness. But then when I was in college during the Vietnam War years, I came to kind of think about war differently. But I always felt like at some point I really needed to come to terms with my views, negative views about war, and the positive view of that particular war, and wrote my doctoral dissertation on conscientious objectors to World War II 25 years ago, and it's just been kind of on the back burner of as a theme I really wanted to pick up. And finally, I decided I would go ahead and see what I could do, and I approach the war not, even though I personally am a pacifist. I approach the war more in terms of taking the kind of the just war approach, the approach of what were the ideals or values that were articulated as to why this war was happening from the American point of view, and then testing those and seeing if in fact those did come to fruition, and basically concluding that they didn't. Part of what I wanted to do that I'm not aware of others having really done very much of is say not only to look at the war itself, but then look at what happened after the war in terms of these ideals of self-determination and disarmament, and how in fact what the World War II did to the United States was create a kind of several major institutions, the Pentagon, the nuclear weapons program in particular, that did not have as their agenda self-determination and disarmament, but in fact just expanding the power and military might of the United States. And then that has found expression in the 70 years since in all kinds of foreign policy problematic efforts. The Vietnam War, probably the most prominent one.
Yeah, I think the most powerful part of your book is the aftermath, the consequences, because all the interventions we've had have been disasters. World War I was a disaster. Vietnam, they go on, Iraq, Afghanistan, but we're always pointed out that World War II was the good war, and that's the one they really use as their principal justification.
That's right. It is, and I think that's why we really need to look at it, because it has become the basis for saying that yes, war can be good, war can be necessary. We have to prepare for it, and then when the U.S. goes to war, it's what's kind of appealed to as yes, we're in continuation with what we did then. Right when I was writing, really starting to write seriously on this book was when President Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize. It was very fitting that in his speech, I mean, I thought terrible, but in his speech, you know, he says good things about Gandhi, Martin Luther King, but then basically says, in the real world, though, we always have a Hitler that we have to resist. And this was right when he was, you know, trying to gain support for increasing our intervention in Afghanistan. And it was pretty obvious, even though he didn't say it explicitly, the connection that he was trying to evoke there.
Oh, absolutely, because that's the one where, oh, you're not supposed to question it. And so they're always going to use that as a justification. The way I kind of divide your book up is into three sections. One is the events leading up to the war, and then the conduct of the war, which I think was very, very powerful as well. But the aftermath to me was the big part. But I do want to touch basically on the events leading up to the war.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you say in the book about that?
Well, I think that to some degree, probably you need to go back at least, well, certainly to World War I and the impact of World War I, which, among other things, created the environment that led to the emergence of Adolf Hitler and National Socialism in Germany and the Communist Revolution, Stalin's ascension into power. And so you have these problems that were really exacerbated then through the 20s and 30s by the inability or unwillingness of the Western so-called democracies to really try to create and help create more healthy societies in those places. But also in the Far East, the competition between the United States and Britain on the one hand and Japan on the other hand as kind of really imperial powers struggling for dominance. And then the kind of the, maybe going back to the early 1920s, the lack of interest on the part of the United States to really develop a positive kind of relationship with Japan, that then, as with the Soviet Union and as Germany, actually empowered the more reactionary militaristic forces within Japan to gain more power. But then, even in the late 30s, I would say, and I know this is very debatable, but I would say that the United States did not have the intention or it did not act in a way that really was looking ahead and saying, how can we manage these relationships with these other countries in ways that's not going to lead to war?
Yeah, I think it's the exact opposite, as a matter of fact. I think my own personal perspective, based on a lot of reading, is that Franklin Roosevelt wanted end of World War II.
Right.
And that when he said in that 1940 campaign that he was going to keep your boys from ever being sent into a foreign war, he was appealing to most of Americans who were totally disgusted with World War I. It had accomplished nothing positive, and it had in fact led to World War II, to Nazi Germany and so forth. And so, but he was lying. I mean, he
Right.
really wanted into the war. And I know there's some debate on whether he knew that there was an attack coming at Pearl Harbor or not. But the fact is, I don't think he was disappointed over an attack.
Well, I guess it seems clear to me that the policies that certainly would go up, kind of end at Roosevelt's desk. The policies were to intensify the conflict with Japan. It was only a few years before Pearl Harbor that the U.S. Navy moved its main base to Pearl Harbor. And at least probably in large part that was meant to be a provocation. And Roosevelt, for several years, clearly Roosevelt wanted the U.S. to get more involved in the conflict, both in Europe, maybe even especially in Europe, and also in Japan. But the amazing thing to me, in this story, one of the amazing things is how powerful and widespread, as you alluded to, the opposition to intervening in the late 1930s, 1940, 41. And so basically Roosevelt's job was to try to overcome that opposition. Uh, uh, and that's one of the, I think that's one of the consequences of World War II, is that the ability or the size of the kind of anti-war forces in the United States was maybe not permanently, I hope, but really was devastated or undermined, or you know, there's, to me, you know, as somebody who, you know, wasn't born until a number of years after World War II, it's just, I just can't even imagine that the majority of the American people would have opposed the idea of going to war in throughout most of 1941, even as late as, you know, even December 6th, 1941. I am sure that the majority, large majority of the people in the United States, and the large, and at least probably the majority of people in Congress, did not support going to war. So Pearl Harbor was a tremendous gift, as was then Hitler's decision, which, as I understand, was really just his personal kind of saying, yeah, we need to join in this war too. And so then they declared war on the United States, because even after Pearl Harbor, it wasn't a sure thing that Congress would support going to war. And then, of course, that points to the other thing, that at that point, Congress, you know, the United States didn't go to war unless Congress said we would. And that has never happened since. You know, we don't have to have Congress say we go to war before we go to war anymore.
Yeah, even though the Constitution hasn't changed at all. I mean,
Right.
at least Roosevelt understood that the Constitution requires a congressional declaration of war.
Right.
But I agree with you. I think he knew that he could never get a congressional declaration of war unless he could maneuver the Japanese into firing the first shot.
Right.
His real objective was to get into the European war, but Hitler
Right.
would never take any bait that he offered.
Right.
And so he looked at Japan as a backdoor to the European conflict. And Hitler gave him what he wanted.
Well,
No.
even after the Germans sank the Reuben James, the battleship, the Reuben James, even after that, he couldn't get support to go to war with Germany. You know.
Right, right. So it really took this major attack,
Right.
and the way I look at it, all the circumstantial evidence points to that Roosevelt was deliberately provoking the Japanese into engaging in such an attack. Let's go on to the second point about the conduct of the war that you talk about in there, and you know, you bring up the firebombing of the German cities, and of
Right.
course Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think the one of the issues, I think, in looking at war, it seems to me, is that we have this tradition, you know, called the just war tradition, that basically says that that war should only be entered into for if there's justifiable causes, and the war should be fought according to certain, you know, there should be limitations to how you fight war, and that a major factor is that you don't purposely kill civilians. You don't. You keep things in proportion, and I think one of the things in terms of the legacy or memory or the way World War II is evoked is it's as if the only thing that really matters is that we assume we had a just cause, and if you had a just cause, or as some people, a lot of people would say, if it's necessary, therefore that's all you need to factor in. Well, the tradition has always, at least officially, maybe not in practice that much, has said, well, it matters a lot how you fight it as well. And I think one of the things that happened, which I think is one of the basic problems with war in general, is that once it gets going, it has its own momentum. And it's interesting because there were many American people, even in the military, who were troubled and opposed even to the British policy from really early on in the war of bombing civilian centers, of attacking cities. But in time, and partly because of changes in the leadership of the American Air Force in Europe, just in time that became less and less. That voice became weaker and weaker, and then finally you get to the point of Dresden near the end of the European War, and the U.S. was directly participated. It was a British act, but the U.S. was directly involved. But then when you get to Japan, and I think there are probably numerous factors, but I think certainly one of the factors was just this momentum. And then we basically had destroyed the Japanese Air Force. The mainline was pretty much at our mercy, and that was then the opportunity to just devastate it. And even before the atomic bombs, the firebombing of Tokyo and many other cities, hundreds of thousands of women, children, old people were just incinerated intentionally. And so it just was this whole acceptance that any means necessary, and it's almost as if part of it, and I guess I tend to believe this, is we just want to keep trying out these new abilities we have to bring about destruction. Like there's just kind of this fascination almost in.
Well, part of it was also, I don't know if I got this out of your book or not, but to send a message to the Soviets.
Yes. Oh, yeah, indeed. In terms of the atomic bomb, use of the atomic bomb, and of course that's continually still very debated and still a present kind of issue for sure. But it seems, I guess, I certainly believe from the reading I've done that one of the major purposes, one of the major reasons why that happened was to send the message to the Soviet Union. Many of the leaders, the U.S. leaders, were looking way ahead. I mean, looking in the future and saying, okay, we're not going to be able to. We don't want to. I would say we don't want to coexist with the Soviet Union. We need to be the only power. And so we're going to let them know that we have this capability. The big irony there, though, is that Stalin had spies very high up in the Manhattan Project, and he knew all about it. Stalin knew more about the atomic bomb than Truman did, because Truman didn't even know anything about it until he became president just 4 months before he used it. But Stalin knew about it.
Yeah, well, that's a nice segue into the third part of the book, and that's the aftermath, which included the Cold War, which I've just always found so bizarre that here they partner with a communist regime, which they didn't have to do.
Right.
They could have fought World War II independently. In fact, I argue is they could have made a separate peace with Hitler where you consign the Nazi leaders to Chile or Argentina or something, but you save all of Eastern Europe.
Right.
From communist domination.
Right.
Instead, Roosevelt says, no, I can't double cross my partner, who is Stalin. And the result of this thing is that they then turned their World War II ally and partner into a new official enemy that justifies the Pentagon, the CIA, the National Security State, and the whole aftermath of the National Security State and the Cold War.
Right. And one of there's a really key moment shortly after the war ended, when the sitting Secretary of War, it was called the War Department still, Henry Stimson, came up with a proposal that the United States would make the nuclear bomb a kind of a global trust, or that we would ally with Great Britain and with Soviet Union, and together kind of manage the atomic bomb. And there was strong support for this in Truman's cabinet, but ultimately the people that opposed that won that debate, and then kind of the next step was, because they erroneously, they didn't know how much Stalin knew, and they had the assumption that the Soviets wouldn't be able to develop that capability for a long time, and so rather than try to find some way to remain partners on some level, or at least coexist peacefully. The idea is, no, we have this advantage now. We need to exploit it, and then of course the really, terrible irony there is the Soviets. This just accelerated their process to then create the nuclear weapons, and we then have this, several times, we come like within an inch of the whole Earth being destroyed, and we still could.
Right. Absolutely, because they're over there stirring up more trouble with them with NATO, Cold War dinosaur.
Right.
But look, Ted, here they have Britain gets into the war supposedly to save Poland from totalitarian Nazi tyranny. And here at the end of the war, the good war, the war that we're all supposed to extol and praise, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, the entire eastern part of Europe is still under totalitarian rule. Now,
It's. I think it just puts the lie to the idea that this war was for the purpose of, well, the three things I talk about in terms of kind of the standard rationale, reasons why we had to fight this war is, one, that we were going to be invaded, we need to defend ourselves and keep our freedom. Like I grew up in Oregon on the West Coast, and the way we said it there was, otherwise we'd be speaking Japanese.
Right.
Now I live in Virginia, and here it's now, otherwise we'd be speaking German.
Right.
And then the second was that we were, we did it to save the Jews, and of course that's another whole aspect in terms of the Holocaust, and the idea that in the Holocaust, or with the Holocaust, that somehow, it's really. It seems to me a terrible kind of jump of illogic, because the idea is that somehow we fought this war to save the Jews, and if we hadn't done it, the Jews would have been decimated. Well, in fact, they were. So whatever the war accomplished, it didn't accomplish saving the Jews from the Holocaust. And then the third would be that we were fighting it to stop tyranny. And that's, in relation to what you were just saying, Jacob, that in fact, the consequence of the war was to increase the number of people in the world who lived under tyrannical, totalitarian government, and Central and Eastern Europe being the most obvious. But I think that the story of China is probably really complicated, but certainly the outcome in China was equally terrible in terms of the Maoist regime and the forced, the famines and just the devastation of China then.
Yeah, they go in there and provoke this war with Japan, saying, oh, look at the terrible things they're doing in China, and they were doing terrible things, but the aftermath is that China is now ruled by a communist regime and has been ever since, 49 or so. But here, what I find amusing is the dichotomy that they say, we won World War II, and we includes the Soviet Union. Well, the people of Eastern Europe never felt that way.
Right.
They don't celebrate this big victory of World War II because they had to suffer under the communists.
Right.
But then they turn around and say, well, now we need a big Cold War against this horrible communist regime that we just delivered all of Eastern Europe to, and we call a victory.
Right.
It was just so friggin' perverse.
Right. But then, kind of on top of that is just this mythology that it was good,
Yeah.
And so, growing up, I would imagine as a typical American, it certainly was my experience. You just don't even question it, and that's why I haven't received a lot of negative reactions to my book. But I think that's mainly because people don't know about it. I think a lot of people would get really angry if they read it or heard what I was saying about it, because it's just challenging this assumption that nobody's ever questioned before.
Yeah, but you know what, Ted? I'm not sure about that anymore. I think 20 years ago you had a point, but all the World War II veterans are pretty much dying off now.
Yeah.
And now it's like, I think people are more opening to questioning everything, especially young people here.
Yeah.
And when you look at the aftermath of Vietnam and Korea and this long war on terrorism that's supposed to last forever, it all comes out of this. And where I've been pointing to is that it's not a problem of getting better people in public office, that it's a structural problem. That World War II also brought us this huge military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, the CIA, the NSA. It structurally reformulated the American government.
It did. That's right. And just for one obvious, simple example, and I can never remember exactly, but something like we were something like in the 16th largest military in the world in the late 30s, between Romania and Portugal, and so up to that point, we would have, we had several major wars, and then we would demobilize, and even I think the use of the term War Department implies that, at least to me, it seems like what that implies is this is something special. You have certain occasions where you use it, and then you don't use it. And when you're not at war, it's small and it's not very powerful. Well, that completely changed because of World War II, and since then, perhaps you could argue that the Soviet army or the Chinese army maybe has more soldiers, but we've always had since then. We are the largest military in terms of the overall might, and now to the point where we're spending about as much money as the rest of the world combined on military, and of course that transformed everything in terms of how government works and economics in the broader society. Yeah, you're right. I agree with you.
Well, it transformed American society. I mean, I think that's the real root of many of the woes that America's suffering, this culture of militarism, of violence. I don't think you can be constantly killing people on a daily basis overseas and think that it's not going to have an effect on your own society.
Well, and I think we are maybe even more seeing that come up, and I mean that manifests itself in different tragedies where you have former military people who are traumatized and then come back and kill people, or I think the whole kind of prison industrial complex overlaps a lot with the military industrial complex, and you have this, like in the last 40 years, we have gone from having an imprisoned rate of about 100 people per 100,000 people to now it's over 700. I mean, it's just a remarkable explosion, and I think that's directly connected with the militarism as well.
I totally agree, and you can see it going down to the local level at the militarization of the police.
Yeah. Oh, and yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's just this structure, and this is what I keep trying to tell people, is that Eisenhower had a point when he said this structure, this military-industrial complex, is entirely new to America's governmental system.
That's right.
A lot of Americans don't realize that this massive standing army and CIA and NSA, it's all new, and in terms of what our founding fathers intended.
That's right. That's right.
Now you have a chapter in there called Pax Americana, which I found was intriguing because my recollection it was Curtis LeMay who had brought that phrase up.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I didn't know that. Yeah, well, that's interesting.
Yeah,
well, he meant it in a good way, I imagine.
Oh yeah, well, in his good way, that America was going to establish this peace through force of arms.
Right.
But what I find fascinating about it is that when John Kennedy was given his peace speech at American University, and he was negotiating or trying to end the Cold War at that point, he threw it back at LeMay in that speech and made a reference to it and said, "I'm not talking about a Pax Americana. I'm talking about a genuine peace here."
Yeah, well, right. I mean, because of course that's based on the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire, and where you have this kind of order and this veneer of peace that is really built on a tremendous amount of violence. And of course now, I guess maybe you could say that the world has changed a lot, though, from the Roman times, and that you maybe tried to establish something similar in terms of this kind of order, but it just won't work. I mean, there's nobody that is capable of that kind of Pax, that kind of empire today. And so there's always going to be, because one of the main things, you alluded to it, I mentioned Vietnam, which to me seems like the biggest expression, the worst expression of this, but many others, is people around the world don't want to be dominated by an empire. And so they're going to fight back. And, that's what's been going on in Iraq and all over the place. And it just, so the Pax Americana can't work. It can't make peace.
No, it's this notion that you can remake the world through coercion and force and killing and bombing, and life's much too complex for that. And so you see a dictatorship like Saddam Hussein, and you think, well, I'm just going to go in there and invade and kill a bunch of people and have a regime change. And then look what you end up with, ISIS and chaos and crisis and death.
Which has happened many other times and places in the last 70 years, too.
Absolutely. And so, but I mean, at least there's hope, if people can see that if you can make a structural change to the government and restore the values in which America was founded, that all of a sudden, hey, now we're looking at a more peaceful, harmonious world. I'd like to wrap it up by giving you a little bit of time, though, talk about your pacifism. I mean, I'm not a pacifist. I do believe in defensive wars, but I read your chapter on pacifism with great interest. I can say that your book is fantastic for everybody, regardless of whether they're pacifists or they believe in the principle of a defensive war. But why don't you tell us a little bit about that aspect of your life?
Okay. I would say that to me, pacifism is, in large part, it's a personal conviction. It starts with a sense that I personally cannot, will not participate in violence. But then with that commitment, then it also involves a way of kind of looking at the world, and I think on the negative side, seeing the consequences of structural violence, war, punishment, as being not really working, even for the purposes that they are, like with World War II. Supposedly it's for the sake of peace and long-term peace, and it doesn't work at all. And so it's kind of a combination of saying, okay, this is what I believe in terms of how I can live, and then it's saying, okay, then when I look at the world through those convictions, I can see on the one hand just how violence doesn't work, and then I can see that there are examples, there are cases where there are nonviolent alternatives that are effective. It's but part of it is, and I have to admit, I'm not familiar enough with libertarian philosophy to know how much you would agree with this, but I would say there's a certain sense in which the state, these kind of big political structures themselves are not that we don't have to give them loyalty. That they are not necessarily even necessary, even though they're there, and we can't live with right now we can't live without them. But ultimately, that the world kind of that I envision wouldn't have a big empire. It wouldn't have a big kind of violent, dependent nation state.
Well, I think you'd find a lot of that discussion and debate going on in the libertarian movement. I mean, it's what is the role of government? Is government even necessary? So that's a very vibrant, ongoing debate in the libertarian movement. But on that note, we're out of time. That's Ted Grimsrud. He's the author of a fantastic book. I would highly recommend just going to Amazon and getting it. It's called The Good War That Wasn't. It's not just about World War II. It gives the whole aftermath of the Cold War and leading all the way to the war on terrorism and where we are today. I mean, I can't recommend the book more highly. So Ted, it's been great having you on.
Well, thank you, Jacob. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. And that's this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, and I'll be back with you next week.